Great Lakes Now, Connect is a co-production of Detroit Public Television and the Nature Conservancy.
Welcome to Great Lakes Now Connect. I'm Christy McDonald. Our program is a joint effort between Detroit Public Television and the Nature Conservancy to focus on issues that impact the Great Lakes and, in turn, all of us who live around the Great Lakes Basin. Today, we're taking a closer look at northern forests. You might be thinking, wait, I thought you just said Great Lakes. Well, I did, and you may not realize that the northern forests, which stretch from Minnesota's North Shore on Lake Superior all the way to the Huron National Forest in Michigan's Lower Peninsula, are one of the country's largest areas of hardwood forest. And the forests are not only teeming with plants and animals, they also act like a filter for the Great Lakes. And what's healthy for the forests is good for the lakes.
I guess some of us just enjoy being outside. We like the fresh air, we like the sounds. A minute ago you heard a crow. To me it creates a very peaceful surrounding setting. And you know, I never get up in the morning and say, oh God, do I gotta go to work today? You know, you really enjoy what you're doing. It's not a chore at all. Makes for a very exciting life. Being on a farm in this part of the country, most farmers worked in the woods when they weren't busy farming, and that's what we did too. So on Saturdays, I would come out with my dad, and mainly I'd steal his tools when he'd set them down and go cut some trees on my own. But then a little later on, about 1950, they did a major harvest of pine through this area. And I would go out on Saturdays with my dad, and I would hold the measuring stick for him and measure out the different lengths of trees, and then he would cut them up into logs. Trees just love to grow here, and if you get out of the way and let them grow, they will. Most of our forests are of a type that will regenerate themselves very well, and I think we still have enough of us left that understand the importance of using the forest and using it safely and wisely. We're in the logging business. That means we cut trees, but we also want to cut them in a way so that we always have trees to cut. Sometimes I think about what it would be like to be retired, and I just don't envision that as a possibility for me. As long as I can keep my body working and my brain working, I'm going to be busy doing something. I suspect if I weren't still physically working at it, I would be spending probably more time on advocacy stuff. Advocating for the forest, for natural resources, things like this. That's probably where I would try to spend most of my time.
I think we all look at that video and just say, wow, we can connect to the beauty of the forest, the value they provide. Now we'll get a deeper understanding of what we need to do to keep them healthy. We'll have a panel to talk about the issues and the solutions. We'll also take you to Michigan's Upper Peninsula for a look at emerging forest conservation strategies that are good for the economy and for our environment. We'll even have a short quiz to see what people truly know about our forests. We also have an audience here in our studio. They will get a chance to ask questions during the show. And if you are watching us online and following along on social media, we want to hear what you have to say too, plus answer any questions that you might have. So find us on Twitter and on Facebook at Great Lakes Now and get in on the conversation. So let's get started with our first panel discussion. I'll turn it over to Dr. Patrick Doran. He is the Director of Conservation Science at the Nature Conservancy in Michigan. Patrick, go ahead.
Thanks, Christy, and thanks everybody for being with us. As we said, today we're going to talk about our northern forests, and we're really going to talk about the conservation and management of those forests, starting with the values of what they mean to us, and then talking about the strategies that we implement across these whole northern forests to ensure that they provide these values well into the future. I have two special guests with me today. First on my immediate left is John Fosgett. John is a co-owner of Compass Land Consultants. It's a forest management company. John's been working with the Nature Conservancy and me for almost 10 years now, and is a great colleague and a great forester. And Bill O'Neill. Bill O'Neill is with the state of Michigan, where he is the chief of the forestry division, and he's also the state of Michigan's head forester. So thanks, guys, for coming here today.
Thank you.
That was a great video highlighting something that really drove the values of Warren and really shaped his life and the work he does in his life. And it makes me think that it's not just those values that have shaped him. So I've been at 2 instances in the past couple years where I've been at a conference and once on the radio where I've heard somebody say, you know, our forests, they're just sitting up there doing nothing. And I think about this vast resource that's really not doing nothing. So how would you react to that statement? What's the nature of our forests? What are the values that you see these forests provide to nature and people?
Well, I think the most obvious value that I think people tend to talk about more frequently is that the forest products industry in Michigan is very robust. It's about a $14 billion, that's with a B, add to our economy annually. 1 in 10 manufacturing jobs in the state of Michigan are based in the forest products sector. That's everybody from the logger in the woods to the truckers who take the product to and from the mills, to then people who make secondary products out of those, from cabinetry to doors, floors. So that's a huge benefit to the economy of the state of Michigan that I think people really tend to focus on. But there's so many other values that the forests bring that we probably talk less about, and we talk about recreation and what it is to live in Michigan and clean water and those kind of things. And those are the areas that I think we really need to stop and think about when we think about Michigan and the upper Great Lakes and its forest values.
So Bill, tell us about some of those from your perspective as a state employee.
We're really lucky to live in Michigan. We're a very forested state, 11th in forests in the nation. And we have lots of non-timber values that our forests provide. Recreation certainly being at the forefront. We're a trail state, one of the top trail states in the nation, #1 in rails to trails across the country, top 5 in ORV and snowmobile trails. We have some fabulous hiking trails. We've got the North Country Trail that goes from New York all the way to North Dakota and goes all the way through our state. So you can go from the southern boundary all the way through the northern lower peninsula, up across the upper peninsula. Just a great place to recreate. So our trails are a huge asset for the forests.
And a little bit about recreation too. So you mentioned that recreation, that trails, people hunt, they fish, they go bird watching these forests.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in Michigan. Bill did too, and I mean, one of my first memories was we had a place in the northern lower peninsula, and like we talked about earlier, when I was a kid, we get in that car, and as soon as you hit sort of Clare and you're heading north, you just get that up north feeling, and that's sort of really ingrained in who we are in the state of Michigan. I think we've all gone up north, and we've all experienced that forest and all the things it has to offer, and it's really important to, I think.
So some of these things are easy to put a dollar value on or easy to quantify, but these things that John just talked about, they're there and they're very important, but it's how we recognize them and how we see them in all of our forest conservation, our actions.
Very true. And for Michigan citizens, I think forests are a part of who we are. And we do, wildlife habitat is very important. We have almost 2 million people that hunt and fish in Michigan. That's 20% of all of the citizens of the state participate in that recreation. So having vibrant wildlife habitat and healthy species is a real important part of our forests.
Do we underestimate the value of these forests in terms of us being at the center of the world's largest freshwater resource? Do we count for that enough? Do we think about that enough in our management and our activities and our conservation work?
Well, I think speaking, as a manager, we all, I went to school in forestry, Bill did, and we tend to originally think about the stand, the tree, the individual products that you can produce from those. But I think now, we look at conservation of the forested landscape holistically, and the water and the air and the trees are all part of that. A lot of the reasons that we have such clean water in Michigan is because of the quality of our forests. So when we develop management plans, we consider what the impacts on water resources are going to be. We consider how they're going to interact with adjacent landowners in different parts of the landscape. So we're thinking more holistically about the system and how we can sort of protect that and conserve that for the future.
Right. So we've talked about the incredible biodiversity. There's hundreds of species of songbirds that turn the forest alive with their song and their colors in the springtime. There's the recreational value, the trails, the hunting, the fishing. There's the obvious timber value, and there's all these other intangibles about what we contribute to the clean water and clean air. What are you guys worried about? What are the stressors that you see now, in the past, now, in the future, that make you worried that the forests aren't going to be able to continue to provide some of these values?
Yeah, you know, I think invasive species for all of us is a concern, and especially for us in forestry. If you look at our hardwood resource, it's really suffered from invasive species over the last couple of decades. So we've lost chestnut out of the forest, we've lost elm, we're losing ash, we're losing beech. Those are important components of our northern hardwood forests, and all of them are falling out as a result of invasive species. So how we react to that and how prepared we are really will help the forest. We need to improve our work in that area.
So what keeps you up at night, John? About the forest.
About the forest, yeah, right. Well, you know, Bill talked about invasive species, and closely tied to invasive species is climate change. So our forests are experiencing lots of stresses from all sorts of different angles, but the changing climate is going to have a significant impact on the forests in the state of Michigan, not only in invasive species, but the way in which these forests interact with the water and the air and with each other, you know, with the species that exist within our current forested landscape. So thinking about how climate is going to impact the forest is important when looking at our resource long term.
And so are you able to, you know, I know in the Nature Conservancy we think about these in our conservation. We make sure we account for the impact of invasive species or the impact of long-term changes and water availability, temperatures, species distributions. How do you think about those either in your work at the state or in your work in a private company?
Well, long-term forest planning is important now. So we can look at see where is the forest going to be as a result of climate change or invasive species. So having forest plans that take that into consideration is an important aspect of sustainable management.
As a private business owner, one of the things that we always try to assess is risk. So when I think about climate change and invasive species, there's a risk component there. So our forests are at risk because of these things. So we're constantly working on projects to help determine how much risk that we're experiencing and how much risk we're willing to take.
Okay, so we're going to jump to another video that's going to detail some of the actual actions that we take on our forests, from stand level management to large-scale conservation planning that tries to account or moderate some of those risks. So now let's head to that second video.
I remember going in the woods behind our home as a child with my brother and cousins and climbing the fallen trees, and you could just spend all day and into the evening and sometimes into the night out there, and you just felt safe, and it just have that atmosphere that you don't find anywhere else in the world.
Pam Lauser is from a small town called Gladstone, just outside of Escanaba in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Around here, spending time in the woods is a way of life. But it's not just camping and deer hunting that draws people to the forest. Logging and the wood products industry are big business in the UP, and they drive the local economy.
If you drive the highways in this area, you're bound to run across some big logging truck on its way to the mill. So there's an awful lot of employment in the woods.
Local workers harvest the trees, transport the logs to mills, and even work in factories, producing everything from paper to floors of NCAA basketball courts. But all this logging and manufacturing is nothing new. The timber industry has been a mainstay of Michigan's economy for nearly 2 centuries.
Originally, they were just some men who went out and chopped down trees. White pine, of course, was the tree they were really after through most of the 19th century.
By 1869, Michigan was producing more high-quality white pine than any other state in the Union. Lumber of all types from Michigan's upper and lower peninsulas was shipped across the country, building homes and hardwood floors in Chicago, railroad ties throughout the Midwest, and of course, paper.
This is a picture of my grandpa and my grandma. I come from a big family. My grandparents had 15 kids, and of those 15 kids, I'd say at least 12 or 13 of them have completely supported their families due to the logging industry. And without that, I'm not sure what a lot of them would have done for a living.
Many families throughout the Great Lakes region made their livings from the forests. In Michigan, millions of pine trees, worth more than all the gold in California, were clear-cut. And after a century of industrial logging, the once massive forests were reduced to a fraction of their original abundance.
Back then, it was really barren. There were just stumps, no trees. You know, they cut every tree down that was going to be of any value to them. And it was, of course, at that time that people began to think, what do we do now? You know, the trees are gone.
The loss of trees wasn't just a problem for the forest products industry. Forests provide a whole host of ecosystem services for people and the environment. They store carbon, filter the watershed, and play an important role in providing clean air. Forests are not just communities of trees. They are complex ecosystems that include many thousands of plants as well as a vast variety of animal life.
What you saw during the period of the 19th century is we completely depleted our northern forests across the entire state of Michigan, which led to everything from the silting in of our rivers and the extirpation of many species, including some charismatic species like the grayling. We had the only Midwest population of Arctic grayling in the Great Lakes.
Throughout the 20th century, conservationists and government agencies worked hard to restore forest habitats throughout the Great Lakes Basin, planting millions of trees and creating nature preserves that are now home to many state and federal endangered species, like the bald eagle.
An awful lot of birds that come through this area. Many of them, of course, are migrating through to Canada. But there's an awful lot of wildlife, birds included, that take up residence in the Upper Peninsula. And yes, it does speak to the quality of the woods and the water of our area.
But with most land in the Great Lakes region owned by private landowners and timber companies, forest conservation requires much more than protecting a few small preserve areas. These days, conservationists, foresters, and loggers must work together to develop land management plans that allow for sustainable timber harvesting that keeps large tracts of forests intact. One conservation strategy in full display is found on the Nature Conservancy's Two-Hearted River Forest Reserve in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Here, John Fosgett is conducting research to determine the best ways to harvest timber without damaging the environment.
Can you have conservation value in a managed forest too? So the hypothesis is that through utilizing the techniques that we're developing, we can have a healthy, diverse forest and still provide a sustainable source of timber and jobs to the economy in Michigan.
Foresters like Nick Munkovich take that research and work with loggers and landowners to create working forest easements, developing sustainable land management plans that produce top-quality timber without damaging the environment.
These forests up here in the Upper Peninsula, they produce high-dollar, high-value logs that actually sometimes get exported to other countries, to be turned. Those are really special logs.
Right now, Nick's overseeing a cut on Forest Stewardship Council and Sustainable Forestry Initiative certified state-owned land. The Forest Stewardship Council, known as the FSC, and the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, known as the SFI, both offer a gold standard certification for forests that are managed properly. In the state of Michigan, all state-owned land holds the dual FSC and SFI certification. Certification requirements include protecting the rights of indigenous people, encouraging biodiversity through selective harvests, and most importantly,
we make sure that these certified land bases, when they cut a tree, they use all the tree.
But it's not just foresters like Nick that have a role to play in keeping our forests around for generations to come. Consumers, too, can play a role in forest conservation by looking for the FSC logo on wood and paper products and ensuring they vote for healthy forests with their wallet. But for most lumbermen these days, practicing good forest stewardship is really a no-brainer, not only from an environmental standpoint, but from an economic standpoint, too.
These loggers rely on this forest just as much as we do. A lot of these loggers, these are family-owned businesses. It's been, some of these are third generation family loggers, and their kids are coming up in it too. So they want to make sure that there's wood to cut too.
Unfortunately, it's not just the timber industry that poses a threat to the northern forests of the Great Lakes. Invasive species like the emerald ash borer, along with the fragmentation of large-scale forests and climate change, all threaten to once again decimate this important natural resource. The best way to mitigate that risk and encourage forest resiliency is through tree diversity and conserving large enough tracts of forest to provide for diverse plant and animal life.
We know that through past management, our forests have lost a certain degree of their diversity. So we're putting seed trees on the ground in the Two-Hearted. We're creating canopy gaps to try to encourage the growth of mid-tolerant tree species such as yellow birch.
Encouraging tree diversification through forest management makes forests more resilient to pests and climate change, and also provides better habitats for birds and other wildlife. But for foresters like Nick, making sure landowners and loggers are managing their forests properly is more than just a job.
Well, I got into forestry because I like the woods. I like to hunt, I like to fish, I like to camp. You know, to me, it is a big deal to make sure that we do things responsibly, and that's what forestry is all about. You know, we believe in cutting trees, but we also believe in growing trees. You know, that's the balance.
And the Yoopers in Escanaba are glad people like Nick are taking care of the forests they love.
As long as those forest initiatives continue to move forward, there shouldn't be any fear for my children or the next generation to ever not have the woods and the trees and that resource for the wildlife, or just for, you know, the campers or people that just like to walk in the woods. It should always be there.
Thanks a lot. That was another great video that covered a wide variety of topics, but they're all centered around about how do we keep our forests as forests, because they provide all of these values. So it covered, again, a wide variety of conservation and management, from very specific discussion of protected areas, the core that provide that context of the iconic places here we have in Michigan, to a variety of techniques that are meant to be broadly applied across this working forest, this production landscape. And so I want to dive into a couple of those, but I liked where we ended up with Charles there talking about, well, what do we do now? Where are we now, and where do we go well into the future? But Bill, I think first, for people and for myself, to understand these forest management, these forest conservation practices, you have to first understand the ownership and the lay of the land. So what's that look like both across Michigan and across the Northern Great Lakes?
That is fundamentally important. So who owns our 20 million acres of forest in Michigan? Well, you and I own the majority of those. 50 to 60% of that is owned by non-industrial private landowners, hunt clubs, family farms, family forests. That's by far the largest landowner of our forests. And then we're very fortunate in Michigan to have public forests. So we've got 4.5 million acres of forests that are state-owned, and there's 3 million acres of forests that are federally owned. So the public owns a considerable amount of those forests, and then investment companies in Michigan own a considerable amount. Over 2 million acres of forest is owned by investment companies. Much of that used to be forest industry lands that have now been purchased by TIMOs and REISs, as they're called, investment companies.
So John, I don't think most people realize that last point. So can you just give us a little bit of background, just a little bit more context about a TIMO and REISa and what that means, investment companies?
Yeah, I mean, when I went to work in the forest products industry, I went to work for a paper company. And at that time, the mills owned the land that had the wood that supplied the mill. About 15 years ago, a transition happened in the state of Michigan where investors started to eye those forest lands, and they started to purchase those from the paper companies. And that's a very different landscape. They own those timberlands for a very different reason, and that's to satisfy their investors' objectives. So what's happened is companies like mine now manage those landscapes for the investment firms, and it's really changed the playing field on how we think about forest management in the Upper Lakes.
So that has implications for organizations like mine, like the Nature Conservancy, for your management company, for the state of Michigan. So once we see that kind of ownership patterns, again, we can protect some of the core areas that are so important to all of us. But that has an implication of the type of management we do elsewhere. So I think the video started talking about some stand level management, some actual forestry practices about how we plan and how we cut and how we harvest timber. So go into those a little bit, John, because you were on the video.
Yeah, I saw that. So about 8 or 10 years ago, the Nature Conservancy actually acquired a piece of property from one of those TIMOs, from one of the investment firms. And at that time, we started to work on a project where we wanted to prove that we can harvest timber, provide a sustainable source of timber to the forest products economy in the state of Michigan, and then have other conservation values. So when we talk about climate change, when we talk about invasive species, when we talk about forest restoration, what we set about to do is demonstrate that we can have all of those values, recreation and clean water, and still have a very viable, robust timber products.
So what actually did you do different?
So, you know, we managed, and we saw in the video that, you know, in the late 1800s, the state was cleared. The forest grew back, and then after World War II, we started to manage those forests. And initially, our focus was providing wood to a mill. So if you had a mill that sawed sugar maple, you tried to grow sugar maple. And so we see species shift and composition changes on the landscape. what we've done is we've gone back into that forest and we're really trying to focus on biodiversity. So with all the threats that we face with invasives and climate change and all these things, we really need to diversify our forest portfolio. We need as many species as possible on the landscape so that when these changes occur, whether it's invasive species or climate, we have something there to fill the void. If we go down the road of trying to manage for one thing, then that becomes much more risky endeavor. It would be like taking your 401k and investing the entire thing in Facebook. Right? I mean, that's probably not something that you would do. Yeah. So we don't want to do the same thing with our forested resource.
That's a good analogy. Go ahead, Bill.
Well, it's important because we're asked as a public entity, are you managing sustainably? So how do you answer that question? And folks all over the world have asked that question. And one of the ways you do that, Forest Science has really created forest certification. So that's where independent third party kind of pokes their head into your management and looks at a number of factors and criteria and makes a judgment, are you managing sustainably? And in Michigan, the state forest system, we have 2 different forest certification regimes that we're managing under. So we're what you call dual certified. But that helps answer the question that the public and forest industry, everybody is asking. We are a huge part of Michigan's economy and want to continue to be, but we want to be sure that we're doing it sustainably. That's one of the ways you answer that question.
So that video, again, did mention certification. So I think across Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, there are probably 10 million, 20, I don't know, acres that are dual certified.
Oh yeah, more than 10 million acres. And really, it's a great story for the wood basket of the Great Lakes. We're going to be able to supply raw product to all of the forest industries and ensure that over 10 million acres of that is coming from sustainably managed forests, and that's what society wants.
So again, to me, what we've done there with this certification is kind of elevate the management of all this this matrix of working forest lands. So how do you see, how has that changed the work of you and of your employees and of your colleagues? What exactly, as I asked John earlier, what's different now that lands are dual certified than it was before they were dual certified?
There's a number of factors and criteria. I'll speak to some, and John can talk about others. Part of it is forest planning. We mentioned that a little earlier. You need a forest plan. Where are you going to be? Where are you looking to do your management? Can you predict over the next 10 years how much you're going to harvest, and where is that going to be? So we spent a little bit of time actually looking at that so we can answer some of those questions. How much aspen is going to be on the market? How much pine is going to be on the market? And there's a number of other factors and criteria that are a part of forest certification.
So what have you seen different about the management under these certification regimes?
I mean, I think as a private manager, we manage about 300,000 acres of certified lands. And I mean, we do a lot of planning and we think about water and all those kind of things. But another thing that as a private forester that Bill spends a lot of time thinking about is like recreational opportunities. How is the public using the lands that we're managing? What indigenous use of the landscapes that we manage. And so we really open up the tent and bring people inside to talk about management on landscapes where it probably wasn't discussed all that frequently. So I think it's been really valuable as a private forester to really think about some of those other attributes that we talked about in protecting here.
Yeah, so again, to get back to those values we talked about, obviously biodiversity is also a key component of that type of certification regimes.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, biodiversity is I think, at the forefront of both certification systems in thinking about your planning and what species you're managing for in the landscape. So.
Yep, very true.
So what do you think, how do we know when these things have been successful? How do we know, I mean, there's a long-term success, right? None of us will be alive at that point, but how do we know when these types of, again, sustainable forest management or certification, or there's also mention of working forest easements, how do we know when these things are working? Sorry to ask that question.
Yeah, that's a real softball. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, I think part of the story is that you mentioned, you touched on that people are demanding certified product. So I mean, that's part of the story. People want to see that their wood that they're using is being harvested responsibly. So I mean, I think there's a success story there, and the response in the industry has been that we're providing that product now. And so there's a real success there. And you touched on conservation easements. When I think about some of the things that we're trying to do at the landscape level, certification is a really big piece of that conservation puzzle. Because that, when you talk about the management and you talk about the things, that's going to ensure that those forests are going to be there long term and that they're still going to provide jobs and recreational opportunities and those kind of things. So.
And I would say just look at Michigan. We've got a great state, and it's a great working example of how you can sustainably manage your forest, how you can have a robust timber economy that's actually improving. And we're going to move that economy from $14 billion to $20 billion over the next 5 years. We're going to do it sustainably. We've got clean air. We've got clean water. We're the #1 destination for cold water fishery in the world. More people come here to trout fish than any other place. That's a good indicator. That's a good bird in the cage, if you will, for the environment.
So what's next? What's this look like in, I'm asking you to make some predictions, 10, 20 years out? Where do we go? What are we moving towards?
So Bill alluded to growing the timber economy from $14 to $20 billion. That sounds like a lot. So how do you do that? We have a resource in this state. We're growing 2 times as much wood as we harvest annually. So there are people eyeing the forest for opportunities to develop a bioeconomy. So I think there's a real opportunity for people in Michigan to look at our forested resource and look that we have a lot of certified product available to the marketplace. But what we need to do is think about that tree after it's cut down, not cutting the tree down. So is there an opportunity to get industry back in the state of Michigan to make floors and doors and windows and those kind of things? I just helped a son-in-law put in a wood floor in their house, and it was Great Lakes wood floors. It came from Tennessee. Right? They're marketing the Great Lakes. There's a picture of the state of Michigan on this box of flooring, and it didn't come from Michigan. So we need those products to come from Michigan, and that's how we're going to grow the economy.
And so we can always track that back to, again, making sure we're providing all these values along the whole way we deliver our conservation and management.
That's where certification comes in. I think we need to develop that certified industry.
Absolutely. Recreation, ecosystem services, all of those important values that are a part of the forest along with the forest economy, that all has to be brought forward together. We can't lose a piece of that along the way.
All right, well, thanks a lot, guys. That was a good conversation. I'd like to just point out that all of these things are in the equation: the conservation benefits, the biodiversity benefits, the clean water, the clean air. And now we're going to go over to Christy McDonald, who's joined by a special guest, and they're going to kind of put our discussion into a broader context.
All right, thanks so much, Patrick. So now we have a good foundation of how forests are connected to the health of the Great Lakes and what some of the threats are to our forests. So let's get a broader view now and more of a national forestry perspective. Joining me now is Bill Banzef. He's a former president of the Sustainable Forestry Initiative. Bill, thanks so much for joining me. I appreciate it.
My pleasure, Christy. It's great to have a chance to talk about something I love.
So we've been listening to these conversations, but I think what struck me most when I was watching you watch some of the video, and I said, the footage is absolutely glorious. And you said you've been working in those forests for how many years?
Well, I hate to tell you, but it's been 40 years, which tells you I've got a lot of experience. That also tells you that I'm old. So,
well, we won't be keeping track. We won't be doing any age keeping track here.
I started working in those forests in 1967 and all throughout the Lake States, Pacific Northwest, and then had an opportunity to go into Washington and actually head up the Professional Society for Forestry that actually accredits all the forestry schools around the country.
All right, so let me ask you, what change have you seen in those years?
Well, and I actually am fortunate to be able to go a lot further back than that, in that my family connection, my father got his forestry degree in 1922 from the University of Michigan, and he actually spent his first part of his career in the Upper Peninsula in the 1920s, where US 2 was a single-lane sand road, and all he saw around him were cut-over, burned-over forests. So that what that really leads to is that the early part of the forestry profession was focused on going back and trying to essentially heal some of the land that had been harvested in a way that was not sustainable. So he was involved in a lot of tree planting, in a lot of development of the early forest management plans. From there, and I think John mentioned it earlier, the real driver was the post-World War II economy and what forestry did to help supply the needs of our society at that point. In the early 60s, we saw the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act, a federal act that really began to shift things to a more holistic viewpoint. And then, of course, I would say in the early 90s, we really began to look at forests from a systems holistic viewpoint as ecosystems, which is truly appropriate.
So how would you say the Great Lakes forests are viewed on a national perspective?
Well, certainly, and I'm biased in that I live here and know the value of those forests in terms of both the strength to the economy, but in my mind, the immense value it has for the quality of the Great Lakes, which is an issue that is emerging to be more important every day.
And do we need to educate people more on what the forests actually do to help out the lakes?
Well, I think so, Christy, and actually, I might say that in my mind, there isn't enough awareness of the forestry issues that we face. We have a very complicated world. People in urban areas are worried about their family economy. We're worried about international issues. Programs like this can really help inform people so that we can do a better job and get more people involved in the sustainability of our forest resources.
So we talk about the forest in terms of economic drivers. We also talk about the recreation, the quality of life, the conservation. Have we stopped thinking about those things in silos? Are we starting to think about them more as all of those things, not just individual things?
And that's really the great part of the evolution of the forestry profession. Certification is an example of that, in that certification requires a look at the social issues, the environmental issues, and the economic issues. When we talk about auditing a forest certification system, we're talking about actual people from audit firms who are foresters, wildlife, fisheries biologists, ecologists, who actually go on the land from organizations like PricewaterhouseCoopers, KPMG, and take a look to see that those forests are being managed in accordance with the principles that are involved in those forest certification systems. So forest certification demands that we look at forests from a holistic viewpoint.
So that job description has really changed then in the number of years.
It has, it has.
All right, let's talk a little bit about, they touched on how a lot of the land is privately owned, a lot of our forests are, and then you have the federal government, and then you have the state governments. How do we get all three of those groups to work on the same agenda, or is there still problems with that?
Well, there are problems, and my sense is that based on the human condition, there will probably always be problems in that. In terms of we can focus a coordinated effort, certification being an example, with the industrial sector, with the federal and state folks, trying to coordinate family forest owners, miscellaneous non-industrial private forest landowners to focus in one area is almost impossible, and frankly, I'm not sure it's a good thing. Because what we're seeing...
Why not? Because people would say, isn't that what you want to do, is to make sure that everybody is on the same page? It's surprising maybe to hear you say that.
Well, it's because the diversity of landowner objectives that we have from various small family forest owners creates diversity in the landscape. Some people care about forestry as producing perhaps income to send their children to college. Others might want to produce it for wildlife habitat. Others simply want to see a healthy ecosystem that they can pass on to their children. So when we have that diversity of objectives, it creates a diverse landscape.
Do we need to raise the national profile of our Great Lakes forests? What would be, I guess, the benefit from that? Would there be economic benefit?
Well, no question. I think that the Great Lakes offers an incredible place to live and to work. And I think that so many times we look to the Pacific Northwest as the beautiful forested area, where our Great Lakes forests provide some of the most magnificent areas to view, to recreate, and to provide for the economy, which helps to maintain the social stability of our small rural towns. In northern Michigan, Wisconsin, we really need to look at that. That's one of the things that I'm concerned about in the future.
And who would be leading the charge on that, do you think?
Well, I think that what we hopefully will do is to see the charge come from a multiple group of stakeholders, whether they be the conservation community, the forest products industry, individual conservation organizations, and most particularly the federal and state legislatures. Much of the work that we need to focus on will come from policy that's established by our representatives.
And there you go. Sometimes it always comes back to politics. And since you had worked for so many years in Washington, do you find it hard to get our lawmakers to understand and value the resource that we have here along the Great Lakes?
Oh, I think that's correct. I think, and we mentioned this earlier, legislators have to deal with a variety of very complex issues, from international crises to the economic concerns we have nowadays. So many times coming to grips with environmental and forestry issues is not at the top of their list. And I think that, once again, programs like this, discussions with your representative, your senator, can make a difference in terms of the way that people understand the value and the importance of looking at this issue.
All right, Bill, I'm going to ask you to look into your crystal ball. I don't know if you brought it with you
I
today,
did,
but all
I
right,
did.
just in case. Okay, so tell me what you think the future of our forests are. What excites you, and what maybe makes you a little nervous?
Well, what excites me is just taking a look at the last 10 or 15 years, and we've seen where we've grown in terms of a systems approach to sustainability. I think that informing the people who love our forests about the forest science that we're involved with, seeing the scientific community, understanding every day more about the intricacies of an ecosystem, a forest ecosystem, that's going to be really exciting. I think we're going to end up with a much more informed public, which will, I think, play a real big role in terms of our healthy forest systems.
Where do you think more work has to be done?
Well, one of the concerns that I have is not directed to forestry, but I think you'd find that the greatest forest loss that we're suffering in all regions of the United States comes from urban sprawl and urban encroachment on wildlands, farmlands, where we're not just talking about over-harvesting, we're talking about permanent conversion of forests to parking lots, to shopping malls and home construction. So that's what I'm most concerned about. I think we have to get a real handle on how we do that in a sustainable fashion.
And take in consideration our urban planning. All right,
Absolutely.
Bill, thank you so much. Stay right here. He is going to stay with us and field a few questions from the audience in just a few minutes. And while we're learning a lot today about the northern forests and the Great Lakes, let's be honest, we don't know it all. So we headed to Michigan's Upper Peninsula, where many people are engaged in forestry and recreation in the woods. We gave them a little quiz. Go ahead, take a look.
What is Michigan's official state tree?
I'm thinking it's either oak or maple.
Oak, pine, maple.
Is it the white pine?
Birch, poplar.
The white pine.
White pine. Okay, that's cool. I love those too.
Is that right?
Why can't I move firewood?
I think it has something to do with all the little microisms and all the little animals and stuff that are in the ground.
Oh, is this whole thing about the emerald ash borer and other invasive pests?
Because of the infestation of the logs, you want to keep the any diseases or bugs local to where the wood is and not spread them.
How do forests help keep our water clean? Probably something like photosynthesis or something.
If I had to make a guess.
Did I mention I was a geography earth science major?
It's just a healthy forest is a good sign of a healthy watershed, which means clean water.
How do we know if a wood product we buy is coming from a sustainable forest?
I have no idea how I know that.
I don't know it.
This is way over our heads here. Sorry.
The way I know is if I or somebody I know harvested that tree.
I think it has to have some sort of official stamp, but I really don't know.
There must be some kind of stamp on it.
I did SSI. I don't know the official name.
I feel like it's like a circle with some sort of tree in the middle of it.
I can't right now. See? But asking questions in a bar.
I'm into buying local, but I don't know that I use that much paper.
All right, we're going to turn to the panel now and ask them, How did our Yoopers do? We have to say it. We did catch them in a bar.
Yeah,
in the UP and asking them some questions. And sometimes when you're put on the spot, you can't totally remember. But Patrick, how'd they do?
My first lesson is for everybody here in the audience. If you're at a bar and a camera comes up to you, go the other way. As fast as you can.
Wait,
So that's my first word of advice. So we had three main questions there. There's one about the Michigan State Tree. There's one about forest and water, and there's one about forest certification. Well, Bill, what do you think about state tree?
State tree's a white pine, fabulous tree. It really speaks of the history of Michigan. So what built Chicago after the big fire? It was our white pine and our red pine. If you're seeking solace and you want a place just to connect with yourself, standing or sitting next to a white pine, that could be the best place in the world to do that. So the white pine is just a great symbol of our forest.
So how are white pine doing? Is this something we're concerned with now? Is this something we're concerned about growing back? Is it something we're thinking about restoring? What about the future?
Well, I think the white pine forests are being restored. And white pine is a great species. When we talk about some of the threats and climate change maybe being one of the threats, white pine is poised to live in a variety of habitats. So it's there. When you look underneath, especially when you look underneath our oak forests, there's white pine there coming in.
So John, forest and water connection, boy, we better know that here in the middle of the Great Lakes.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about the Great Lakes, you think about water, right? And the reason we have such clean water and so much beautiful water is because we have great forests. And so, when you think about a watershed on the map and all sorts of different ownerships and all sorts of management taking place, but, at the end of the day, I think we've done a pretty good job managing our forests for protecting our water resource, but there's opportunities to do better. One of the projects that we've done is looked at entire watersheds and looked at road stream crossings as being the single biggest threat. So anytime we cross a stream, there's an opportunity for sedimentation and those kind of things. So as forest managers, we're thinking more and more about road stream crossings. As landowners, I think we understand that interaction, and it's good for the fish, it's good for the water, it's good for the communities downstream.
I bet when you were in forestry school, you weren't thinking about road stream crossings and trout too much.
No, I took a hydrology class, but I don't really remember it too much.
I'm sure you did great.
Yeah, I'm sure I did too.
And so, Bill, do you get a little worried when people say, how do we know if the product comes from a sustainably harvested, sustainably managed forest?
Well, I think it provides us with an opportunity to inform folks that the profession of forestry and its involvement with products has really, really evolved to the point where you can look at a certification label, whether that be FSC or SFI. Between those two systems in the United States and Canada, most of the public and industry or investment lands have been certified. SFI is certified 200 million acres now. So looking for that label on the product is important.
I think I would just piggyback a little bit on what Bill said, and Patrick pointed out the fact that even though people are in the UP and they work with the forests and they live about them, that still there's a lot of misinformation out there, that people can constantly be educated about our forests and ways to work with them.
So is there a role for your various organizations to play in that education, that outreach, that expanding that knowledge base?
Yeah, I think in the Department of Natural Resources, that is one of our goals and objectives. We want to talk to the public. We want to talk about clean water. We want to talk about clean air. We want to talk about sustainable forestry. So you hear us have those conversations, and hopefully you'll hear more of those conversations when we talk about the values, the timber value, the recreation value, the ecosystem services. All of those are important, especially in Michigan. That's who we are. Forests really make up a big part of the public citizenry in Michigan.
And so, Bill, you also involved a little bit in further education of the forestry profession. Do you see these types of discussions? Is the dialogue, is the requirements, is the curriculum, is it expanding to include all of these things?
I think it is. Just if you take a look at the accreditation standards, forestry schools and natural resource programs around the country, you see an evolution from a fisheries or timber silo-based organization to this holistic view. So I think we are seeing that without question. Now, in terms of my role as a retired person, my role is primarily to enjoy these forests.
I can piggyback on something that Bill just said. We've got two great forestry schools in the state of Michigan. As part of my business model, I hire young foresters all the time. And what I can tell you is that young foresters are certainly educated on the idea of ecosystem services, ecosystem dynamics, landscape level management. So I think the young foresters that are coming out of our universities in Michigan are pretty well-rounded and understand a lot of the issues probably better than we did when we graduated from forestry school.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, guys. I think we have some audience questions.
Yeah,
as
so
well.
now if you gentlemen can stay right there, we're going to open it up. We've had this great attentive audience this entire time who I'm sure have a lot of questions. Sir, come on over here. Why don't you go ahead and give us your name and tell us where you're from.
I'm Warren Sahosky. I'm a logger from Menominee County in the UP.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Warren, go ahead and direct your question to the panel.
I don't know, maybe I should comment rather than asking a question. I'd like to follow up on this water quality stuff, but here's my question. In addition to the bugs and the diseases that we are familiar with, what do you perceive to be the future threats to forest health?
Who wants to take that one first?
Maybe I'll start a little bit with invasive species. Thanks, Warren, for the question. We've got Asian longhorn beetle that's really at our doorstep. It's in suburban Columbus. It was in Chicago. It's on the East Coast. That beetle preys on maple trees. It has a host of 30 different species that it will prey on, but its favorite host is maple. That's the #1 forest type that we have in Michigan. If that pest comes into Michigan, it again will substantially change our forests as we know them today. So we really need to be vigilant in invasive species, watch that, and not let it in our door.
You know, I think to me it really points out the importance of I think across all of our organizations of the importance of planning ahead of time. So again, with the Nature Conservancy, when we think about our forest conservation, we try to do an exhaustive planning to think about what are all the potential stressors to our forest systems. And I think for something like invasive species, it really gets back to collaboration amongst all of our different stakeholders, all those different landowners. It really stresses the importance of kind of early detection and rapid response. We've talked about that with aquatic invasive species, but it's just as important that we share information on the detection of these terrestrial invasive species as well.
All right.
I guess if I could just
go ahead,
do
Bill.
a quick addition. We talk about biological diversity in forests, and for some folks of our viewers and in the audience, you might remember the tree-lined streets with American elm. It was only elm, and that lack of diversity when the Dutch bark beetle came in resulted in actual destruction of beautiful forested avenues. So diversity has its values.
And I think a lot of people can relate with the ash borer as well when ash trees just
It gives us options to these stressors.
Okay. All right, we have another question. Hi, ma'am. Go ahead and tell us who you are and where you're from.
I'm Carolyn Schultz, excuse me, from Ann Arbor,
All right.
southeastern Michigan, right here. My question is, what about the human intervention, invasive of fracking, and what effects that will have or could have on the water? Who's in charge of that, decisions and so forth?
So again, we have another land use question here, and we oftentimes think about fracking or energy development, or I think this also leads kind of biomasses. How do we account for those in our management of these vast landscapes?
Well, I think that clean water question is a question for all uses, not just forestry, for energy development, for recreation. No matter what the development is in the forest, clean water and assurance of clean water is really important. So we have a Department of Environmental Quality that regulates those type of activities. And they're looking at that. If fracking, if forestry, if trail development, if anything is compromising our water quality, we're going to need to make those changes quickly.
Some of the real issue there is creating that balance between our concern about non-sustainable uses of our lands and the need for a strong economy that can support some of our small communities. Many of the small communities in the Upper Peninsula are simply growing smaller and smaller. The high schools are being shut down. So it's really important, and some of the issues we see at the local level is trying to balance, what do we want to make certain that we do to protect the environment, yet also provide for social and community stability.
So my last thought on that is the fracking issue is not just a water quality issue, it's also a land use issue. And some of our colleagues, Nature Conservancy's colleagues in Pennsylvania, have looked at the impact on that development on the landscape and how we can minimize the fragmentation. So it's not just the water, but we also have to inform the design of the pads, of the roads, and try to limit and minimize the impact that can have on the landscape as well.
All right, thanks so much for your question, Caroline. Does anybody else have a question over here? Go ahead. All right, go ahead and give us your name. Tell us where you're from.
Lloyd Semple from Detroit.
Okay, Lloyd, go ahead.
Patrick, and maybe this is for Jim. I heard a lot of defense against invasive species being directed at diversification of the forest. Do we just give up and write the obituary to the ash tree and surrender to the boar? Or are there other developments that are occurring with respect to invasive species and winning the battle against them?
With respect to the ash borer, it's very well established in the lower peninsula. The upper peninsula is still, there's pockets of emerald ash borer, but it's still sort of localized. Given the winter we've had, we're hoping that the ash borer doesn't like -35 temperatures. So, but you know, it's so pervasive on the landscape at this point in time, it's going to be difficult, I think, to really stop that trend. I think we're going to be able to slow it. We've done things with quarantining wood when we can move wood, those kind of things. But yeah, the writing's kind of on the wall for.
But we do have some successes, and I'll give you one quick one. Beech bark diseases is taking beech out of the forest at the same time ash is. But there's some beech trees that are resistant. So we're finding those trees that are resistant and then propagating those trees. So they might be the next generation of beech. So there are some successes. I wouldn't write the obituary yet.
All right, well, we've had a lot of good conversation here, a lot of interesting issues brought up and some good solutions. So, Patrick, I'm going to hand it over to you just for our final minute here to kind of give us what should we be taking away from today?
Yeah, I was at home yesterday, and my son poked his head in the door, and he said, "Yo, Dad, I'm going to be out in the woods." And he slammed the door shut, and I think he was saying that as he was running out the front. And I think I've said that to my parents, and I bet you have all said that to your parents, and I bet your kids and others, that I'm going to the woods. And we all know what that means, right? We all know that means that solace, that exploration, those valuable areas, that nature. And so I think we've talked about a variety of strategies here to make sure that our woods are always there, whether it's the core conservation areas or these broad sustainability initiatives or working forest easements, all these things. And I think it's not just us, but it's that whole collaboration of all those stakeholders, that whole community that can make sure that these forests remain as forests. So thank you all for coming today.
Yeah, all right, thanks so much to Patrick Doran, and thanks to our panel today and to our Great Lakes audience who really engaged in the discussion. It's been a great conversation about the impact of healthy forests on the Great Lakes and also how to engage private landowners to manage forests that sustain business, but also work for the environment. For what's happening in your state, just go to greatlakesnow.org. For all of us at Detroit Public Television and the Nature Conservancy, I'm Christy McDonald. Take care. We'll see you next time.